This video will cover the last two looping statements, while and DoWhile, and thus conclude the Java control flow statements. In general, the while statement and the DoWhile statement will repeatedly execute a block of code as long as a given condition is true. The definition is similar to that of the for statement, but I'll go more into the similarities and differences throughout the video. I'll start with the while loop and then move on to the DoWhile loop, but even before that, I'll first jog your memory on the general format of the for loop so I could show you the similarities and differences between the three looping statements. At the very end, I'll also mention when to use each of these statements. So feel free to use the timestamps in the description below to skip over to the required section. But, as always, I'd recommend watching the whole thing for a solid understanding. So let's get started. If you recall, this is the general format of the for loop. In a single line, you can initialize a loop variable, define a Boolean condition which is evaluated before each iteration of the code block, where only if the condition evaluates to true do we execute the statements in the code block. And finally, after every iteration of the code block, we have an iteration step where we update this loop variable. Both the while loop and the DoWhile loop also have these three components. However, where the for loop covers them all in one line, while and DoWhile will split them across 3 lines. The while loop, which is also sometimes referred to as the entry-controlled loop, looks like this. We start by initializing the loop variable. Then we start with the keyword while, followed by a conditional statement, which is a Boolean expression within parentheses. After this, we can start the code block with curly braces and fill it in with the statement or statements we want to iterate over. And at the very end of this code block, we need to update the loop variable we initialized in the beginning. By update, I mean either increment or decrement the variable. So as you can see, just like the for loop, we initialize only once, and then before entering into the loop, we check the condition. If the condition evaluates to true, we execute the statements in the code block, and then execute the iteration step before again looping back to check the condition before determining whether we iterate over the code again or not. And that's it. That's the general structure. So now that we know what the general structure looks like, let's look at an example. First, we have to initialize the loop variable. Let's say the loop variable is an integer called I, and we assign it initially to the value of 0. Then, while I is less than 15, we'll just simply print out the loop variable. Then we increment to update this variable, and that's it. So when we run this, we see that as long as the value of I is less than 15, it gets printed. Once we hit 15, I is no longer less than 15, so the condition is not satisfied, so the loop will terminate. Notice that when we don't update the loop variable, we get an infinite loop. This is the case when the conditional statement never evaluates to false, and thus the loop never terminates. You can tell when it doesn't terminate when you look at the scroll bar on the right and it keeps scrolling down. Another instance of an infinite loop, which is sometimes useful, is when the condition itself is true. In this case, the Boolean statement never evaluates to false, because the condition itself is the Boolean value true. That's the basics of while loops covered. So now we can move on to the general structure of DoWhile loops, which are also sometimes referred to as exit-controlled loops. Just like the while loop, first we need to initialize the loop variable, and then instead of using the while keyword immediately, we use the do keyword and open up a code block which we fill with the statements we want to loop over and the iteration step to update the loop variable at the very end of this code block. Then, after closing this code block, we then write the while statement, but this time we need to have a semicolon at the end of it. Notice that this is one of the differences between a while loop and the do-while loop, where the while loop didn't need the semicolon after the while statement. For the do-while loop, we do need the semicolon after the while statement. Now that we know what the general structure looks like, we'll use the previous example, but rewrite it in the form of a do-while loop this time. You'll notice that in this case, when we run it, the output is exactly the same as the while loop version of the code. So you might wonder, what's the point of having these two while loops? Or what difference does it make in the way they function? And it has everything to do with the order of the while statements. It's what makes the while loop an entry-controlled loop and the do-while loop an exit-controlled loop. To show the point of it and the difference between the two of them, let's say we have a value of I that doesn't satisfy the loop condition at the very first iteration. Say we initialize I to 77. This is greater than 15, so the condition will evaluate to false. In the case of the do-while loop, when we run this code, we see that we have one iteration of the code block. But when we use the same initial value of I with the while loop, this time we don't have any output at all. The reason for this is because while loop is entry controlled. This means we check the condition before we even enter the code block. We enter and execute the code block only if the condition evaluates to true. Otherwise, we just terminate the loop and continue on with the rest of the code. In the case of the do-while loop, after we initialize the variable, we do one iteration of the code block regardless of whether the condition evaluates to true or false. If you notice, there's no condition for the do keyword, so the do-while statement will unconditionally execute at least once. However, after the first iteration, before we exit the loop, we check the loop condition. If it evaluates to true, we don't terminate the loop, but instead we loop back to the do statement and execute another iteration of the code block. If the condition evaluates to false, then we would have to terminate the loop and continue on with the rest of the code. So, as you can see, the do-while loop checks before we exit, hence why it's an exit-controlled loop. Now we can start to think when to use these three looping statements we now have knowledge of: the for loop, the while loop, and the do-while loop. Generally, the for loop is used when we know exactly how many times we want to iterate over a block of code. The loop variable is generally used as a counter of sorts in this case. The while loop is usually used when we don't know how many iterations we'll have, but only wants to iterate as long as a certain condition is satisfied. The do-while loop is used again when we don't know how many iterations to expect, but we want to execute the block of code at least once, regardless of whether the condition is satisfied or not. But after the first iteration, any other iteration is executed only if a condition is satisfied. You should also know that we can use compound logic operators, such as and, or, and not, when defining these loop conditions. Other than that, that's all the basics of Java control flow statements done. I hope you found this and the other videos helpful. Please like, share, subscribe if you did. Comment with any suggestions or recommendations. Anything is helpful.